This video lecture will focus on three types of leadership as studied throughout this course. We'll talk about those three types of leadership, compare and contrast them, and talk about leadership in higher education, as well as my own leadership philosophies. When discussing leadership, it can be a bit confusing. The difference between a leader, a manager, a supervisor, does your position make you a leader, informal leaders, is all kinds of things. I'd like to break down the difference between leadership and being a manager. In higher education, as with many other jobs, due to the way the system works, there are leaders, both informal and formal, and managers. Managers are those who do the work, who have people underneath them and supervise their work. So if there's a project or task that needs to be completed by this department, this team, the manager is the one who keeps them on task and makes sure they complete that work. The difference, however, whenever it comes to a leader, is a leader is someone who not only manages the task and makes sure that things are getting done, but they also motivate the team and make decisions that will affect the productivity of that department or team. The first type of leadership that I will discuss is trait-based leadership. Trait-based leadership is one of the person-centered theories. This means it's leader-centric. All the focus is on the individual rather than the collective. The followers aren't so much a priority in this leadership type, but it is all based on those traits of the leader. Those traits could be ambition, drive, initiative, perceived ability to lead based on anything that the followers value. This does lead way to some bias. Whenever we're judging someone based on traits or perceived traits, we could be excluding others and their ability to lead because they don't exhibit those traits as the group deems necessary to lead. So this could affect staffing of departments. It could affect how teams are built, how they work, all because leaders are picked based on these traits. Trait-based leadership is a branch or stems from great man theory. In great man theory, you're simply born a leader and you're deemed fit to be so just because. A lot of times, great man theory applies to the stereotypical leader, the white male who's 6'2", a leaner figure with a lower voice. All these things are things that tend to be, whether explicitly known or not by the followers, those traits sought after in leadership. The research on trait-based leadership does go back and forth. There's some areas where the research says trait-based leadership is effective and is a valid form of leadership and leadership theory. There are others that say trait-based leadership is all based on the perceived ability to lead. There's no actual facts, there's no quantitative data that prove that these individuals with these certain traits are any more inclined to lead than anyone else, leading to the belief that trait-based leadership could be one of the more exclusive versions or theories within the study of research and leadership. Strengths-based leadership is also a person-centered theory. Strength-based leadership is similar to trait-based leadership, focused on that natural ability to lead. I think about an example of a kid who walks to the bat for the first time in baseball and knocks out of the park. You were born a natural. So in this area of leadership, people are thought to be born leaders. They have certain strengths, whether that's their confidence in large crowds, their voice's ability to carry and sound in large groups, all those things would be strengths. Whether those strengths could also be the ability to talk to strangers or build rapport with someone on in a short time span. All those things are strengths that are sought after talents within leadership or those who are in leadership roles. All those things may have an effect on hiring, staffing of organizations as well. throughout the hiring process for a department, for example, those who are sent to evaluate potential candidates may look for certain strengths among the candidates rather than the merit of their resumes, for example. They could look for they might want someone who seems very outgoing or someone who's an extrovert, for example, just because they feel like those strengths would make them a good leader. They have that, therefore they can lead and they should be on our team. This again is that person-centered theory, so it's all focused on the leader and not so much the followers. The followers will fall in line if the leader has these certain strengths. Bias can also be present here as the followers get to deem what strengths are valued on their team. So it can be exclusive in that way. And it could also be very face value and judgmental. I think you have these strengths, whether it's maybe you say you have these strengths, and I believe you can be a leader just because of those things. Connective leadership is a third type of leadership we'll talk about, and this is a relationship-centered theory. So it emphasizes the people and the process. Here, the leader is not the center or the focus of the group. Here, we're all about the process and getting from point A to point B, however that is possible. And hopefully the leader can make connections to get that done based on their relationships. Connective leadership, as talked about in the book for this class, uses this kind of chart to break things up in these categories. So connective leadership has these branches. So if the leader wants to contribute to others' tasks, he may help whenever whenever they give direction. Maybe they collaborate and join forces, or become a mentor to those that supervise, trying to build those relationships and lead through that means. Maybe they want to be more direct. Maybe they want to take charge of the situation and kind of rule how it will happen. This leader is more hands-on, more authoritative, and using connective leadership in that way. Or maybe you want to maximize your interactions. Maybe you want to build social networks, empower your team, try to get buy-in and persuade your team to follow you. This relationship-centered theory is all about, again, the people in the process. So the leader kind of has to decide what works best for my team in this situation or this individual in a staff. Connected leadership kind of gives you the flexibility to do that more so than strengths-based leadership or even trait-based leadership. If you don't have the certain strengths or certain traits to be a leader in those instances, then you probably aren't expecting success, or that team isn't expecting success. Whereas with connective leadership, the leader puts themselves in the middle, but tries to figure out what the followers need. So there are a few commonalities and differences between these three types of leadership that I discussed a bit earlier. There's trait-based leadership again, strength-based leadership, and connective leadership. The trait-based and strength-based, those are both person-centered theories. So again, focused all on the leader and not so much the collective, where connective leadership is all about building connections between the group and finding out what works best for each individual staff, and figuring out how to best serve those who are following you. The differences, again, are those, or is it people-based, or are we talking about just the leader? The pros and cons of these really come into play with bias situations. Trait-based leadership and strength-based leadership really do lead way to a lot of bias, where connected leadership forces the leader to kind of remove themselves personally and figure out, again, what works best for the collective, what things they need to tap into within themselves and open up with to best lead the best result. Where trait-based and strength-based is kind of, you get what you get. And also the amount of research involved with these three, strength-based leadership and trait-based leadership, have probably the vast amount of differing opinions on the leadership of those, how valid they are, as compared to connected leadership, where there's more of a concrete evidence that this type of leadership is more productive and actually quantifiable. My own leadership philosophy, I consider myself pretty strategic in how I lead, thinking of myself more as a connective leader, trying to figure out what works best for me and the individuals that I'm around as a leader. As a hall director, I am, of course, a formal manager of a staff of 8 individuals, of 8 RAs, but I do consider myself a leader amongst that group as well. And again, it's important to separate those two. You could just manage. You could get the job done, point A to point B with all the tasks that I have for my RAs. But it's important for me to be strategic in my leadership, to get buy-in from them, and be a balance of professionalism and interpersonal connection. I think connecting and building relationships with those who I consider my followers as a leader will yield a better result in the end product. As far as how I like to be led, I like someone who has confidence and a wealth of knowledge regarding the work to be done. So a supervisor who steps in not as a know-it-all or not intimidating, but someone who I can tap into as a resource if I have questions and those types of things. And also a reflection of myself in the supervisor, someone who can balance the professionalism and interpersonal connection. I'll talk about it a little later in higher ed specifically, but with my role, that balance is really important. It's kind of hard to only be a manager in my position or even my supervisor's position if you don't have professionalism and you don't have interpersonal connection. And I find balance with those two things. Leadership in higher education takes a few different roles. It shows up a few different ways. The first way is through bureaucracy, the top-down approach. So, the UNC system has its leader, chancellors, the board of chancellors, and it goes on down to the universities and their trustees and all the stakeholders all the way down. You can trace a line of managerial status all the way from the chancellor on down to the student as far as that works. This bureaucracy it labels the managers in higher education, and it does make it difficult to sometimes see who are the leaders in higher education. Of course, those who manage do lead in some aspects, but as far as a day-to-day, that more relationship-centered leading, that doesn't really happen so much. You can't the chancellor, for example, can't have those relations centered use those relation-centered theories when approaching leadership to those who are 3 and 4 steps behind that individual. There's just too many people, too many humans for that to be a productive process. So the bureaucracy does get in the way in that respect, but it does lead way for those mid-level managers to take leadership theory and use it to their advantage. The second place it shows up, strength-based leadership in higher ed does show up in particularly building departments on college campuses. Anytime a recruitment committee is built and they're reviewing resumes and they're interviewing folks, bringing people on for on-campus interviews, there's a team aspect of every department, every division that is looked for, and those teams are very much put together based on strengths. We love in higher ed a strengths finder or some kind of metric to tell me what kind of leader you are, what your strengths are. Are you better with communication, with interpersonal relationships? Are you better administratively, or are you with what kind of things? What kind of leader are you, and what are your strengths, and how do you use those in your leadership? Those are questions often asked when looking to hire folks in higher education. So if you look at any department, you can probably pick out the different strengths within the room to get the job done. It's kind of the way higher ed tends to work and tends to build departments based on those strengths. And the last place is social change model of leadership development, looking at the individual, the group, and the community. So higher education is this magical place where there's a blending of identities, ideas, demographics, statuses, identities, all those things, all blending together in this wonderful melting pot on college campuses. So it's a great microcosm of the United States, of even the global society. So finding ways to find out what the values are of individuals, what the group values are, whether that's a residence hall or certain department on campus, certain majors, finding out what makes them tick, and the community at large. What is the university's message? How does the chancellor relate to the student? What does that look like? What is the makeup of a college campus? What is the average student? So finding the commonalities between the individual, the group, and the community, and then expanding upon them so that everyone kind of rises their social conscious just a little bit, I think is a huge goal within higher education. And I think just about every leader on a college campus in some way, hopefully, institute social change as a metric of their own leadership capabilities, but also the lessons they teach. I think the lessons inside the classroom are just as important as those outside of it, and higher ed definitely does that through the social change model of leadership development. That kind of wraps it up, but to summarize everything, so looking at the three types of leadership I talked about today, trait-based, strength-based, and connective leadership. One is not, I won't say one is better than the other, but there are definitely those that are more conducive to success, particularly in higher education, looking at those relationship-centered theories versus the person-centered theories, trait-based and strength-based. So connective leadership is probably more common on a college campus, but everything came from the book and this class so far. So that's kind of my philosophy on leadership.